Well, we were in an Aleppo neighborhood earlier today, which was one of the first neighborhoods where people were telling us demonstrations began. And they're also saying it was, in fact, the first neighborhood of Aleppo to fall to the rebel forces. Now, residents have actually begun to come back, which is an indication of just how far forward the rebels have been able to push the front line in Aleppo. In fact, they're estimating that they control, or at least the regime does not control, around 65% of the city. In this particular neighborhood, some residents were in fact coming back. There was a fair amount of activity in the streets amidst all of the rubble and the destruction. We were watching families picking their way through. In some cases, people were trying to get the electrical cables up and going. Of course, there has been a massive blackout in electricity here. In other cases, just trying to clear out the rubble. We went to a bread line where we met a young woman who had been waiting there for 3 hours. But she said that she had no choice but to do that because she had 3 children to feed. Her husband had, in fact, been wounded by shrapnel when they returned back to this neighborhood thinking that it was safe enough. We also met a young boy who was just 14 years old, and he was collecting water into a plastic container right next to where a bomb had recently blown out one of the main water mains, and his arm was in a sling. He had been wounded in the village his family had actually fled to for safety. So even though we are seeing, civilians returning to this part of the city, life is by no means normal. And of course, the threat always continues to loom. But many of them, Jonathan, have no choice but to return at this stage because it's winter, it's becoming incredibly cold. Conditions when they're forced to live in other parts that they've fled to for safety, either tents or crammed into buildings, are incredibly difficult. So many of them are taking a gamble right now by returning back to their homes.
Obviously, if you don't have food or water, the internet isn't a big concern. Without electricity, you wouldn't notice, but reports are of a nearly nationwide communications blackout involving the internet, cell phones, and a lot of landline phones as well. Are you running into any of that, noticing it at all?
Oh, absolutely. The cell phone network has been down. The internet is down. We obviously have our own means of communicating and of getting online, but that is creating incredible difficulties. We've come across numerous rebel fighters, for example, who are struggling to communicate between units. Many of the activists as well having incredible difficulties communicating amongst one another, not to mention uploading the various YouTube videos that really is their weapon in this war. And those videos, of course, have provided all of us an incredible window into what is taking place here. And the indications are at this point, at least from some of the experts, that the government itself would in fact be responsible for this kind of a massive nationwide blackout, especially given how extreme it is at this point in time. Of course, the government is blaming the terrorists for this blackout at this stage, but activists themselves are also convinced that this is most certainly the work of the government. And the impact is really being felt in so many different ways, from, as I was saying, those activists who are trying to upload videos, to even families who hear bombings in one part of the city or in certain neighborhoods who want to check up on their families, and they quite simply can't call them. It's cell phone service and it's landline service as well, Jonathan.
Well, I want to ask you about the opposition forces. They have been famously or infamously fragmented all through this conflict. Are they relying on ordinary cell phones and landline phones to communicate? And are they now even more fragmented than they were before?
Well, it's a different kind of fragmentation. The opposition fighters have, of course, always faced issues when it comes to coordination amongst various units. There have been various efforts amongst them to try to create a more cohesive entity. They did recently form a front, 5 different fronts rather, in different parts of the country, but they also face challenges because some of the units that are out there, namely the Islamist Salafi units, do not want to adhere to this chain of command. That's one sort of fragmentation. Now, of course, they are facing great difficulties communicating with one another because, yes, in many instances, they are relying on cell phones, especially when it comes to long ranges. They don't have the sort of sophisticated technology that a conventional military would have. They don't necessarily have long-range radios or long-range capabilities to communicate to one another, except for the use of cell phone networks.